Okay, good morning, everyone. I see Peggy's outside, and that's it. That's too bad. I was hoping to see lots more sunshine. Welcome to lucky number 13. This is our 13th week of lockdown together. We're certainly happy that you could join us, and we have a whole bunch of things to talk about today. So, as usual, if you have questions, please send them to us in the chat. We're happy to try to answer general questions online, and more specific questions we can get back to you during the week. I should remind people that the training program that we put together is online and being used. I think I'm kind of looking at Brittany for a number, but I think we have 27 municipalities that have participated in that so far. So that's been going very well. Again, the real thrust of that is certainly to keep your folks safe, but also to ensure that you have documentation indicating that you have trained your staff to deal with return to work after the crisis. So that's the online training that we have. So we're going to get started. We have a number of things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk, Tim's going to give us a legislative update. I'm going to talk about summer vacation and COVID and what that might mean for your municipality. Mia is going to talk about long-term financial impacts of COVID on your municipality and planning for dealing with that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about modernization and reopening ideas and opportunities that municipalities have as a result of this. And we'll finish up with Mia's helpful reminders. And so, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Tim, who has only half a face today. And Tim is going to talk to us about, there he goes, there's his full head. Tim's going to talk to us about the legislative update. So, Tim, if you can tell us about the news this week.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, again. Nice to see everybody. This week was another interesting one for COVID. We've seen some interesting developments this week. Probably everybody's aware, but it's worth mentioning that the province has extended the declaration of emergency to July 15th, and so the emergency orders are expected to continue. I know I've looked at some of them now, and they still have some of them online now still have a June 30th expiry date, but it's expected. I expect that will be updated. It seems, as Paul Spot is saying, that it's normally after our webinars that the government chooses to do these, do make changes with respect to COVID, and actually it's proving true. Doug Ford is speaking at 1 o'clock today, so if anybody wants to tune into that, he's got a Queen's Park announcement. I'm sure he's waiting to take some tidbits from our webinar today to add to that. But just the takeaway there, guys, July 15th, I expect the emergency orders are going to be extended to that date as well, although right now they have an on or before date of June 30th. I know in the announcement the province has said that they're going to continue to review those orders with a view to whether they will be extended or some lifted. Even before June 30th, the orders themselves give the province the authority to do that. They say valid until June 30th unless revoked earlier, and so stay tuned. Keep monitoring the government's news site, because I suspect that we're going to see some new developments shortly. I believe Ontario reported one of the lower numbers. I think it was 182 perhaps in the last 24 hours of new cases. So there are still new cases. It seems like the curve is flattening, and that's a positive thing. So much so that it seems now that the province has decided as well to open Toronto and Peel region as part of the stage 2 reopening. So Toronto and Peel have now moved have now moved to stage 2. Windsor has not. Windsor, some people may have seen in the news, Windsor's been particularly hard hit with COVID. And one of the things with Windsor is, some people may have seen in the news, is that the health unit for the health unit in Windsor has actually mandated, has ordered that anyone in going to a commercial establishment in Windsor has to wear a mask. And so we've seen that because of the particular problems that Windsor's been having with the spread of COVID-19. We wanted to clarify though, because Nuala had spoken last week about masks and our opinion with respect to municipalities and masks. And so I did want to clarify that because you may have seen that in the news, it was the health unit and not the city of Windsor so the city of Windsor didn't pass a bylaw. It was actually the health unit that made an order mandating the mask wearing. And so I just wanted to clarify that, because that was a fairly big news story, and something that we talked about last week. And I just wanted to make sure there was no confusion between what we had said with respect to municipalities passing bylaws for mask wearing and what was happening in Windsor. So the other big news this week, and it's not so much news about COVID-19, but in speaking with the group, I think it's important to share with everyone. It's actually a really important employment law case that came out last week. It came out on the 17th, I believe, of June. It's a Court of Appeal decision, as I say, and it's really important. It's really, really important because it fundamentally changes, or at least clarifies the law with respect to termination provisions of contracts. And so I just wanted to share that decision with you and just talk a little bit about it, because I think any municipality that is considering terminating an employee right now, or should consider reviewing its contracts very carefully in light of this decision. And I'll tell you why as I take you through it. So the case I'm talking about, it came out June 17th. The case name is Waxdale and Swegan North America, Inc. And essentially what happened in that case is they had a director of sales for the company who was making about $200,000 a year. So he was quite well paid, and he was terminated without the company terminated him without cause, and paid him two weeks pay in lieu of notice. He sued, not surprisingly, he sued for wrongful dismissal and argued he hadn't gotten reasonable notice of that. So he was looking at getting common law notice, which I think most of us have talked about before, and the employer was trying to rely on the termination clause in its contract. So the termination for cause provision, everybody said, so he wasn't, so he was terminated without cause. There was a for cause provision in the contract, and everybody in the case conceded that breached the Employment Standards Act, that clause shouldn't stand. The employee took the position that because, even though the employer wasn't relying on that clause to fire him, that because that clause breached the ESA, the entire termination clause should fail. So the question was, even though the clause that the employer was relying on, which was the termination without cause, did not breach the Employment Standards Act, should it be allowed to stand, notwithstanding that the for cause provision could not? And so the lower court looked at this and said, well, you know what, the employer is not relying on, and it came down to severability. There was a severability clause in the contract that basically said, if any of the provisions in this contract should be held illegal, etc., then the remaining provisions shall stand. And that's just a paraphrasing of it. But the lower court said, they said the employer's not looking to rely on the for cause provision, And so the fact that it doesn't meet the ESA requirements and can't be upheld doesn't matter, because the employer is not relying on it. We don't need to sever anything from the contract because the employer is relying on the without cause termination provision, which is okay. So the employee appeals to the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal says, no, we disagree with the Superior Court judge, and essentially we're going to look at the contract as a whole. So you need to read the contract as a whole, and because the Employment Standards Act is remedial legislation, we're going to take, from a public policy perspective, we, the Court of Appeal, are going to say that if one part of a termination clause fails, the entire clause fails. And the reason that the public policy reason that they did that is because they said termination clauses should be interpreted in a way that encourages employers to draft agreements that comply with the ESA. And so the consequence of non-compliance should be more than an order not to comply. And so they wanted to give a greater consequence to employers to draft termination clauses that comply with the ESA. And so the idea is that the key takeaway from this case is that if you have, we used to think, and there was some lack of clarity, which is why I'm sure the Court of Appeal took this case on, is because there was a lack of clarity around, well, could your termination clause be saved if you had two separate clauses, one for termination for cause and one with termination without cause? And if one of those clauses failed, if a court said, it doesn't meet the ESA requirements, and so it's not enforceable, or it fails, I should say, altogether. If your severability clause, which we often put in employment contracts, and they're still a very good idea to put in, because the Court of Appeal's decision right now, at least, only applies with respect to termination provisions, and so I'd still encourage the use of severability clauses until there's further case law on this issue. But right now that severability clause won't save a defective termination provision, even if it's not the provision that you're trying to rely on. So if you're trying to dismiss an employee and you don't have a cause, if the employee is able to argue that the for cause termination provision, even though you're not relying on it, is defective, then you won't be able to rely on any of the termination provisions in your contracts to effectively terminate that person's employment. So the consequence there is that they'll be permitted to get their full statutory and common law entitlement, notwithstanding that you may have tried to limit that through the termination provision. So it's a really, really important case. And it's also really, really important, I think, from the perspective of, as we come back from COVID-19, and I'm sure staff, obviously we talked about deemed leaves, etc., but I'm thinking to myself that some places may well be looking at staffing changes as we move forward, and this is a major development. And so it's really important to review your contracts, and I think that this is a key issue. If you're looking to terminate anybody, let us know. Certainly we'd be happy to help you with that. Have it reviewed by somebody, though, I think, because it's so important to understand this issue, because it can be a very, very costly one. And there are ways that even if you have an employment contract currently, that if a review is done and it looks like the termination provision is not going to be upheld, we can help you with amending that contract and how to have an employee re-sign that, in ensuring that the re-signing is going to be upheld. So we can help you with reviewing those, make sure that they're as bulletproof as we can make them, and make sure that if they do need amending, we get those amended, and we have the employee sign in an appropriate manner, and ensure that you're going to be protected if you're looking to terminate anybody. So very, very important case. I know it's not a COVID-19 related case, but I thought I would mention it anyways, because it's so important and it just came out. So that's essentially my legislative update for today. If anybody has any questions about that case, or wants to talk about employment contracts, I'm more than happy. All of us are more than happy to do that. So let us know, and look forward to hearing from you if that's the case. I'll turn it back over to Paul now, and I know he's got some maybe some things to say about that case as well. So.
I do, Tim. Thank you, and I got a question for you to see if you can help. So the first point that I want to make about this case is that it also changed the law with respect to termination for cause. We have seen a number of termination clauses, we've drafted them, that list what it means to terminate somebody for cause. And usually we say there are a number of things where you could be terminated for cause, things like dishonesty, things like theft, things like taking steps that would put the municipality into disrepute. But one of the important things that the Court of Appeal said is that you have to draft a termination clause, even the for cause part, to be consistent with the Employment Standards Act. And the Employment Standards Act says that you can terminate for just cause, which is different than for cause in the common law. And so the Employment Standards Act, just cause means willful misconduct or willful neglect of duty. It's a bit of a higher standard than the common law. And so it's possible that while you might have common law cause for termination, your lawyer might be saying to you, boy, we got a bit of a problem because it doesn't meet the employment standards threshold, and we might lose the whole termination regime. So it's important, it's really important, I think, to have all of your employment clauses that have large termination clauses and large without cause clauses looked at. Now, there's an interesting question that comes to us, and I want to ask Tim this question, and that is, if the contract is drafted by an employee as opposed to drafted by the employer, how is this case going to be interpreted, and how is a clause going to be interpreted in the contract? Do you have any thoughts about that, Tim?
I think it's always going to be open to anyone, because I think we have to go back to the public policy reason for the court's decision. And the public policy reason is they want to see contracts drafted that comply with the ESA, and they no matter who drafts them, the idea is the court doesn't want to encourage people to try and be tricky with their contract language, try to contract out of the ESA, try to contract around the ESA. So from that public policy perspective, it's my opinion, at least, that it would be open to an employer to challenge a clause on the basis that it violated the ESA, and notwithstanding the employee drafted it. The court's decision is primarily geared towards employers, because generally speaking, it's employers that draft the contracts, and there's that power imbalance. But when you have perhaps a senior level employee who's presenting a contract, I do think it would be open to, an employer to make the argument itself that this clause can't be enforced because it violates the ESA. I think regardless of who makes the argument, I don't think a court is going to permit a clause to stand that's contrary to the ESA. And so I think an employer would have an obligation to the court to bring that to the court's attention in a case like that. And so I do think a court would permit the argument to be made that by any party to litigation, that in an employment law context, employer or employee, that a clause couldn't stand because it violated the ESA. I don't think a court is going to. I think the court's goal is compliance with legislation. I don't think the court's going to care who makes the argument. I think the court's going to want to make sure that the contract complies, and I think that's the overarching public policy goal that it's going to follow in making that determination. So that's my thoughts on that. I think it would be open to an employer to make that argument call.
So the result of that is going to be that if the termination clause is cut out of the contract by the courts, you're left with a common law notice period. And so it will be an interesting balancing act to see whether the court rules in favor of an employee or an employer who is asking to pay common law damages instead of contractual damages. Now, the counterpoint, the argument that I would make if I was arguing against him, is that a municipality, regardless of the size of the municipality, is going to be seen as a sophisticated employer. And most municipalities are represented by legal counsel or have access to legal counsel. And so if you as a municipality are represented by legal counsel when you're entering into the contract, the flip side argument that could happen, and we'll see where this goes, is the court might say, well, you were represented by legal counsel, and so you contracted for this gold-plated termination clause, and we don't think it's fair that the employee get the short end of the stick versus the big unlimited funding of a municipality. Because one of the things the courts looked at, and I've seen this argument before, is that they say, well, if municipalities need money, they can just raise taxes. And so you've got an unlimited supply of money. You and I all know that that's not really the way the world works, but I've seen that in court. So the short answer for this is that this case from the Court of Appeal last week has fundamentally changed employment law in Canada. Well, at least in Ontario. And as you're going forward with any kind of restructuring that may affect people's employment, even if you're not removing people, but you're just moving them within the organization, it's a good idea to get some advice. Any other points on that, Tim?
One thing I just wanted to mention on that issue as well, and Paul makes a really good point, and it's going to be interesting to see how this goes, because the Employment Standards Act is really about employee rights. I mean, it's employee protection legislation essentially, and so the court's concern is making sure the employee gets at least their statutory entitlements. And I think that it would certainly be a convincing. Paul's argument would certainly be a convincing one if the contract clause in question was providing much more to the employer, much more benefit to the employee, and the employer was represented by counsel. It would certainly be sort of a cheeky argument, let's say, to try and suggest that the whole an entire clause should fail because it didn't violate the ESA. It would be. I mean, I think we're going to see it happen. I think we're going to see that those arguments made, and I don't know what's going to be ultimately what's going to be successful. But I think it underscores what Paul's saying is, you know what, this case marks a really good time to look at your employment contracts, and let's make sure that we don't get into a situation where any argument like that has to be made on either side. So.
Okay. So as much as I like employment law, we're going to move on a little bit. So the issue that I want to talk about at this point is vacation. And one of the things that we have seen happen with a number of employers who have been deemed essential services, and I think that this would also apply to municipalities, is that lots of employees who have entitlement to vacation have not taken their vacation. And also lots of employees who have booked vacations for trips overseas and what have you are finding out that those trips are not going to happen. And so as we're dealing with the outcomes of the crisis. We are seeing a substantial increase in mental health related problems. And so it takes me to, I guess, another employment law proposition, and that is that the employer has, subject to a collective agreement, the employer has the right to decide when employees can take vacation. And so a good practice now at this point, particularly for your senior staff, but really for everybody, is to revisit vacation and for employers to encourage employees to take vacation now. And I can tell you in our office, we're suggesting that people start to take a day or half a day here and there to have some time off to rest and recuperate. We have embarked, of course, on a new normal since March 19th. And I know from the phone calls and emails that I've been getting from lots of you that we've been working crazy hours. And that has become what we're used to now. But it's not good for us. It's not good for our bodies. It's not good for our minds. And so I wanted you to understand that as employers, even though your staff might be looking well, coming to work, behaving what you think normally, we have all gone through a crisis together, a worldwide crisis, and it's affecting people differently. And so some advice that I have to you as employers is to visit your vacation process, to encourage people to take vacation, to change rigid vacation policies to open them up to flexibility. And one of the things you might want to look at, there is an order from the provincial government permitting municipalities to staff operations as required, notwithstanding collective agreements. I think there's probably an argument to make there that means you can look at requiring staff to take some time off to rest. And so if you have a collective agreement that deals with vacation, and almost all of them do, we're happy to provide you some advice and analysis of that. If you don't have a collective agreement and you're not a unionized municipality, then I think it's a great idea for you to put some advice to council, for council to amend any policy that prevents this kind of vacation and encourage people to take some time now, and frankly to push them pretty hard to take some time to rest and recuperate, because one of the personality traits that we're learning about with senior staff, and I know that my team suffers from the same personality, is that we live to help our clients, and you live to help your ratepayers. And we think that that's the most important thing in the world. And if we can't take care of ourselves, then we can't take care of the people that are relying on us. So it's a really important issue to get staff to take vacation, and particularly to look at the impact that the lost time from the crisis has had on them. So that leads to some updated information from the Algoma Public Health Authority. So historically, for the last 13 weeks anyway, maybe the previous 12, Algoma Public Health was recommending against traveling outside of the district. And that advice has changed. And so the advice now is no longer to restrict your staff from traveling outside of the district, but to enter into a new phase and a new policy where what happens is, if your staff are traveling for their vacation, that decisions about what to do with the staff depend on where they're traveling, the circumstances of their travel, and the events of their travel. And so as an employer, it is okay for you to put a policy in place that says when your staff are traveling, they need to tell you about the circumstances of their travel. So for instance, we had a member of our firm who traveled for a vacation outside of the district. He had a trailer on behind his truck. He put gas cans on that with food and water, and he did not stop to have contact with any people. He went to a remote location where there were no other people, and he came back. When we talked to the Algoma Public Health, they said that was a low-risk activity. And so when you learn about the circumstances of your employees' travel, feel free to call the health unit. They'll be happy to talk to you and measure the risk that that person has had. So if they participated in a low-risk activity, you know, if I went to Ottawa like that and visited my mother who's been completely isolated, they would say that's low risk, and so that person can come back to work. If I went to Wasaga Beach and hung out with a whole bunch of people on the beach, they're going to say, "Whoop, that was a high-risk activity." So then, in order to bring the people back into work, you would need to do one of two things. You would need to go on a quarantine for 14 days. And that quarantine period is not something that you have to pay for as an employer. The encouragement is that you have the people use vacation time or sick time to cover those 14 days. But the other thing that we can do now is we can go and get tested. And so you can definitely require an employee who has decided to go on a higher risk vacation to be tested and have a negative test result before they come back in the workplace. So the advice from Algoma Public Health, and check your health authority if you're not in our district, has changed a bit so that we can travel a little more widely, and they're looking at the circumstances of that travel. Now, I wanted to show you a flyer that they have shared with respect to traveling to camp and cottages. And so historically, they have been saying, we don't want people traveling from the GTA to their cottages in Muskoka. That was not popular with those folks who owned cottages in Muskoka, or those folks who owned cottages in Pancake Bay. So the advice from Algoma Public Health, and you can get this off their website now, is don't travel if anybody is suffering from COVID. That makes sense. If you go to your remote location, they're asking you, please don't use the local health provider. So don't use the nurse practitioner clinic. Don't use the single practitioner's office if you can avoid it, unless it's an absolute emergency. If anybody in your party exhibits symptoms of COVID, return home immediately. Call 911 if you have an emergency. Bring your provisions from home. So what this means is, just like I was suggesting with our worker that traveled outside of the district, he brought his own gas, he brought his own water, he brought his own food. This way, he didn't have to interact with local people. So if he had the virus, he wouldn't be bringing it to another location. So encouraging people to bring their provisions for the entire stay to their cottage. Tips for staying healthy are kind of obvious, but useful. So travel with your immediate family, because you've already been with them for the past months, and don't visit others outside of your immediate family. If you do go out, practice the 2-meter distance. I've been so impressed with the Municipality of Halifax. They really took an interesting perspective with respect to social distancing. And instead of the signs that we see throughout our city saying, remember to stay 6 feet apart, Halifax has put signs all over the place saying, remember to stay 2 lobster traps apart. Remember to stay 3 Canada geese apart. Remember to stay an oar length apart. And I just think that that attitude is so positive for ratepayers and for your community. So then the standard: wash your hands frequently, bring all of your medical supplies with you, and do what you can to avoid tasks that may result in injury. So you may go to your cottage, but perhaps don't do the knife throwing, or maybe leave the dirt bike in the shed for a few more months. So there's some advice from Algoma Public Health, and you can get that from their website. Okay, that was a lot from me, and now I'm going to hand this over to Mia to hear about the long-term financial impact advice that she's got with respect to COVID. So over to you, please, Mia.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the long-term financial impacts that COVID-19 is going to potentially have on municipalities. So, you know, as we know, the impact for each municipality is, of course, going to be different. But we do know that no matter what, there will be an impact. So when we look at municipalities that generally house a lot of industry, you know, things to consider are, will those industries restart? Will they have the same tax structure and assessment base as they did before? And we see a lot to do with oil and gas, supply and demand. That's all changed. So we have to keep in the back of our heads, how will that affect the industries that our municipalities house? And then how in turn will that affect the tax base, which in turn is going to affect revenue of the municipality. So when I look at Sault Ste. Marie, we've got the steel plant, we've got a tube mill, and we've got a particle board plant. So as of right now, things seem to be pretty good, but you know, are we going to see the effects in the months to come? Then we look at the commercial sector and how COVID is going to affect that. So we worry about how the commercial sector will bounce back. There are a number of effects on shopping patterns, whether people are using online shopping or not shopping at all. Are people going to be comfortable going back to the shopping mall? We don't know. Are people just not going to bother online shopping and not shopping in the mall and just completely ceasing shopping? This is all things that we have to, these are all things we have to consider. So the municipality also needs to be on top of the commercial tax base. What if there's lots of vacancies because small commercial businesses aren't going to start up again? Will storefronts continue to look the same? We don't know. We're already seeing a change of you know, little mom and pop shops that decided right at the beginning of the pandemic, we're not going to survive this, we're going to close, and that's it. Businesses may no longer be viable, and again, the municipality may not have that tax revenue coming from certain businesses, or if they do, it may be reduced. We don't know, but these are all things that we have to kind of think about right now. Also too, what efforts are our municipalities making for support of small businesses? So we see a change in our behaviors and our habits, so it's difficult to tell what's going to happen, but we need to have a plan. Buying patterns, of course, have shifted to the point where there's going to be an impact on vacant commercial space and so on. So we might not see these effects until the economy fully gets going again and we've completed all the phases of reopening and we're, you know, operating at the highest point possible. We're also going to see a change in office environments. So a lot of places have decided to continue remotely for a long time or to go remotely permanently. So the effect that's going to have is either they're not going to have office space anymore and it's going to be vacant, or They may get rid of a big building that they're in and downsize to a smaller one. So again, the tax revenue that comes from office buildings and office spaces, might change. We're seeing a huge shift and sometimes the complete pivot to significant number of workplaces that are going permanently remote. We saw that Shopify is, Facebook is considering it. Those are obviously some big companies, but we're going to see it on a municipal level as well. So we have to also remember that everyone is looking to see where they can save money at this point. Other things to consider: are we going to see a change in construction? If we do, is there going to be less building permits that are going to be issued, less occupancy permit revenue? If people still aren't comfortable going out in public for long periods of time and downtown and places that have paid parking, we're going to see a change in parking revenue as well. The housing market as well is something that may change. People may be moving to smaller areas if they can now work remotely. My dad was just telling me a story the other day how there was a couple that had moved into the subdivision over. They had built a new house and they had moved here originally from the Sioux, but were working in Southern Ontario. And both the husband and the wife, both their employers said, you will be going permanently remote. So they didn't need to be in Southern Ontario anymore. So they moved to a smaller location. They came to Sault Ste. Marie. They built a house and they're going to be working remotely here. So there's also going to be a shift in that as well. And again, tax revenue. So that seems to be a common theme here. And again, people may not be able to afford the homes that they were in. They may move, they may downsize. So will there also be an adjustment of service levels? Will things have to be cut for municipal services? Every municipality, again, is different, and each will have to make that call to their specific municipality. And in doing that, you're going to have to look at what your core business is and what your core business is and the core service requirements. So that's what I have to say this week about that. I know it's food for thought, and it's to kind of get everybody thinking about that. And hopefully in the weeks to come, we'll have another update on that. But for this week, I want everybody to kind of get thinking of how we're going to see revenue change and different ways that we can combat the negative effects of it. And some other things too, in supporting small businesses locally, maybe encourage, I think I said this last week, we're going to miss out on a lot of events this year. Like I said here, Rotary Fest we're not having, Rib Fest we're not having, trade shows have all been canceled, and those are big revenue boosters. How can maybe that be moved online in a smaller scale way where you can have the trade show online, you're still supporting small businesses in the community, and you're still going to generate some revenue for them as well. So I leave that with you all this week, and I will turn it back to Paul.
Thanks very much, Mia. Mia, as you were talking, I was counting on my fingers the number of days that we've been locked down. And as I count, it's going to be between 98 and 100. That's a bit of a magic number because under Section 364 of the Municipal Act, there's a potential argument for business properties to say, well, we've been vacant for 90 days, and they may make tax rebate applications under Section 364 of the Municipal Act. I'm not sure whether the province is going to deal with that, to say that the 364 vacant unit rebate program is suspended during the COVID crisis or not. Stay tuned for that, and we'll try to look into that further. But that is something that might affect your municipality if the province supports the vacant unit rebate application. All the businesses that were closed might be applying for 30% of their municipal taxes to be refunded from them. So that may affect budgets on a go-forward basis. And in the event that you get that, certainly give us a call. I've done a lot of municipal tax assessment work and can help with that. There's two sides to that. It might be something that your municipality wants to encourage businesses to do in order to give them a bit of a rebate and some assistance, which would avoid a bonusing problem. But it also may be crippling for your budget. So there's two ways to look at it for municipalities. So this leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that is the idea of modernization. It really comes a lot from what Mia's been talking about. So we have now proven for about 100 days that if the municipal office is closed, the world doesn't stop. And so that gives councils an opportunity to look at the services that are provided to ratepayers and try to decide what it looks like for reopening, or what it might look like for reopening. So there's nothing in the Municipal Act that requires you to have a municipal office open 5 days a week. So it might be, particularly because of the financial hit that we're all going to take, that the municipality says, you know what, we can save a little bit of money by being open 3 days a week. Or we could be open by appointment only, or something like that. So that sort of modernization and reopening concept is something that council should be looking at to decide what they want the municipal service to look like on a go-forward basis. And that leads into one of the topics that I really like to, or one of the ideas that I really like to encourage municipal councils to do. And that's a concept of a council term plan. Usually we're telling councilors to develop a council term plan at the beginning of the term so that we can have a clear indication of what the priorities are for the municipality. But the council term plan might be something, if you have one, that you want to revisit for reopening, particularly because where we have been focused on the response to COVID, there may be millions of issues outstanding. So it's a really good idea for council to think about developing a council term plan so that they can focus on the important issues of the municipality for the remaining 2 years of the term. So again, I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I think it's a really good tool for staff to advise council to think about a council term plan immediately, so that they can really have a good eye on the direction that they want the municipality to move for the next 2 years, the remaining 2 years of their term. The other thing that goes along with what me and I have just been talking about is the electronic meetings. So once the emergency is ended, and I'm sure it's going to end, we're going to go back to the old rules, most likely, about electronic meetings. So that's going to mean that we'll have to have a quorum of council present in council chambers to have a meeting. But what we've seen is that the electronic meetings have allowed many, many more ratepayers to participate. And so councils might consider, even though they go back to live meetings, encouraging a number of councillors to stay away and participate remotely so that we can do social distancing, particularly in small council chambers, but also continue to have your meetings broadcast over Zoom so that ratepayers can watch what's going on. And so NULA has a discussion about compliance fatigue, and I see that she's just back. And so I'm going to hand this over to NULA and not let her have any chance to compose herself, and just go right into compliance fatigue. NULA, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the lack of breathing room. That's perfect. It's wonderful to see everybody again this morning. Thank you very much. It's a good indicator that people are feeling well and healthy and safe, and that does mean a great deal to us. We're concerned, and it's wonderful that you can join us. And again, our heartfelt thanks to each of you for devoting your very valuable time to us on these webinars. We hope that they're valuable for you and that they give you some helpful practical advice that you can employ in your work, but we also, it's easily the favorite part of our week. We love preparing for it and we love presenting them. And we always have a little postmortem afterwards and talk about it. It's our absolute favorite part of our practices, I can assure you. So I just wanted to talk for a minute about compliance fatigue. And this is really what we're seeing when people have been complying with the precautions that have been put in place by local health units, by the province, in terms of social distancing and hand washing, and people are getting sick and tired of it, frankly. There was a quote in an article I was reading from National Post about how people are feeling about the next 100 days. That was an interesting quote. I thought it really summed up. It said, it's optimism tinged with anxiety. And that's really what it is. We're hopeful that things will improve, but there's anxiety about a second wave, about the unknown, about, in fact, I was reading also that if the virus becomes so omnipresent among human beings that everyone has had it, or the majority of the population has had, it might revert back to animal species and then morph into something quite different again. So, I mean, there's lots of reason for anxiety, but what we're really seeing is people have that cabin fever. They're tired of being inside, indoors, and we're getting looser on the precautions. So when you first heard, when you wash your hands, it's a 20 to 30 second, sing the happy birthday song and make sure you get the nail beds and all that. People, you saw, in restrooms and before people would have lunch, you really saw that sort of diligence. And now you're seeing people with kind of like a little rinse, and a splash of hand sanitizer and they're on their way. And also you're seeing groupings. I know here, for example, in one of the local parks, I've seen people, like families with 10 and 12 people outside and at a picnic table, but that's a lot of people. And we're really seeing it, as we saw sort of very concerningly in Florida with some of those beaches that have reopened. And I would be remiss if I didn't say something about Disney. And Disney has delayed its opening date. The California Disneyland has delayed their opening, and now Disney World in Florida, there's actually a petition from their staff saying we're not going to be ready on time. So please make it a little bit down the road. The thing about getting sloppy with precautions is we've already seen that the precautions have made a direct impact on the containment of the virus. So if we become sloppy about it, we're back in the same hot water that we were on March 17th. So you are, as an employer, and a very unique employer because you run some very unique settings, facilities, swimming pools, ice rinks. So you're not just inviting your staff back, you're also inviting members of the public back, and hopefully in the not too distant future, attendees at your council meetings and your licensing hearings and all the rest of it. So how can you, as an employer, as a nonprofit that runs a number of recreational facilities, how can you ensure compliance in the wake of this non-compliance that we're starting to see? So I have a couple of tips for you. The first is always use a unified set of fact-based messages. So that goes back to what we've said all along about the source of information. You want to use credible health sources like the World Health Organization, the CDC, local public health agencies. That's what you want to rely on, rather than more salacious news or anecdotes. And it's funny in Sault Ste. Marie, because it's such a small place. You hear, oh, there's 3 cases in the hospital, and then you talk to someone that actually works in a hospital, and they'll say there's none. There's no cases. So that sort of scuttlebutt and rumor. That's what you really want to stay away from. You want to make sure your messaging comes from reliable, credible sources. Next, tailor your messaging to your audience. So I think we may have mentioned in the past, if you have a play area, you don't want a very text-rich billboard for 6-year-olds who are anxious to get on the swings. That's not going to work. So you want colorful, bright, simplistic messaging for your play area. You might want something a lot more complicated, as you're entering City Hall. And then think about your staff too. I'm always amazed at the level of illiteracy that there is in Canada, and our workplaces are no different. But illiteracy is a great silent secret. When people are illiterate, they have managed to find a way to cope into their adult life so that they don't have to actually read or expose the fact that they cannot read. So sometimes be cognizant of that depending on the work area. And that might be a better area for simplistic graphic messaging rather than, again, sort of text rich. And then for anybody who's over the age of, I'm going to say 20, sometimes your vision fails and it's not as crisp as it once was. So for people like that, I'm not one of those people, but there are people that have trouble reading text. So again, crisp imaging, and some of the things that we learned from accessibility, like a strong contrast, a black white, a red white is a lot more punchy, a lot easier to see than gray on white or something of that nature. Carefully choose your messenger. So when you're giving across the message that in City Hall we expect people to be masked and we expect this, and when you're giving that, we're concerned about you, make sure that that message is coming from a suitable messenger or messengers. So by that I mean CAOs, clerks, treasurers, if you have a media person, someone like that, but you don't want it scattered about. You want one person or a handful of people or a handful of managers that are constantly repeating the same messaging, so that it has the level of torque that it deserves. There's other ways you can message that are much subtler, but they still get the message across. These are called nudges. So you're nudging your public and your staff to do the precautions. So things like markings on floors so that you can maintain that sort of social distancing. An abundance of disposable masks and gloves available, hand sanitizer available, so that these things are repeating in people's heads. Oh, I should be keeping my distance. Oh, I should be washing my hands. I should be masking. And that sort of subtlety will actually get across. And of course, as we've said, all of anything that you can post and refresh in terms of hand washing and keeping your distance. If you see any of those websites that we've mentioned with the WHO and the CDC, they all have posters, and Ontario Health does, and actually the health unit in Ottawa has very, very user-friendly images and checklists and so on. So you can easily download some of that stuff and post it up in your workplace, because people get immune to that blue and gray hand washing sign, and you forget it, and then it no longer has any impact. One other point that we're seeing that is leading, I think, to some of this compliance fatigue is it's such a unique time in history. Not only is this going on with the pandemic and the subsequent states of emergency and so forth, but it's a time of great political activism, particularly in the United States, but it's flowing north in terms of things like Black Lives Matter rallies. When you have people gathering in huge groups like that because they're doing something that's politically important, sometimes you have a view that what I am rallying for is so politically important, it eclipses the virus. I'm going to risk it because this political rally is so imperative, and it is a very politically active time. You're seeing there's even a group in the Sioux that's looking at defunding police. So that is going to spread, and people are taking it to the street, and they're taking it to parking lots of universities and having these rallies. So that, I think, is almost justifying, like, this is more important. And everyone's sick of the virus, everyone's sick of talking about heroin. Here's another way to channel your feelings and your emotion. You're going to something that's politically active, but the social distancing, the masking, and all of that, is that falling by the wayside? So it's a very, very real tug of war, I guess, that's going on right now. But I have to say, health has to trump. Health has to be the cornerstone. There's no political rally. There's no politics. There's no people if we're not healthy. So a couple of tips for you there in terms of bringing people back, and to be aware sort of this compliance fatigue and apathy that people are experiencing, and do what you can to kind of curtail that. So those are my comments for this last Friday in June.
Thank you, Nuala. Okay, Mia, where's Mia? Mia has some helpful reminders that she said she said would be about 30 seconds. So quickly over to you, Mia, and then I'll wrap it up.
Thanks, Paul. So this week, I just kind of wanted to focus on the positive that, you know, when everybody works together, we work better. Don't hesitate to reach out to see what other people are doing right now as things start back up. Like I said before, communication is key. You want to make sure that you give the proper guidance and the proper support to everyone. And employee communications, again, like I said, are extremely important. And it's a good way to make everybody feel like they're being supported during this. So, you know, like I said, when employees slowly start to return to work, things will be changing daily, by the hour, and make sure that in order to make sure everybody has the same information, have one person responsible that will communicate updates, and have that point person that can take questions from employees or visitors that are attending your municipality, and have someone designated to maybe prepare a weekly newsletter that's going to go out to everyone that will have updates. People are going to have lots of questions, so another good thing to do is try and anticipate what kind of questions will be asked, and that way you will be prepared with an informed answer. And one last piece that I have to remind, just be kind. We're all in this together. Everybody's going through something a little different right now. We've all taken COVID a little differently, and everybody's stressed, everybody's anxious, so it's important to be kind. So that's all I have for this week, and back to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Mia. So finally, I just want to remind everybody that all of these webinars have been approved by AMCTO for your continuing education. So make sure that as you've been attending, and we've certainly seen a lot of people attending on a regular basis, that you keep track of that and put that in your report, because it's all eligible for your AMCTO training. All right, well, we're slightly over time, which is kind of normal, but thanks so much for attending. Thanks for your questions. And we will see you in 2 weeks. You'll see that in the poll that we're not around this week, and I've lost the poll, so I can't show you the results. But we'll see you next week. Take care.